Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Buckman. I'm the Executive Director of the Stress and Trauma Treatment Center and clinical psychologist here. Today is a training about screening and recognition practices, especially for those who are at the front line that are answering the phones or maybe the first contact for families that are reaching out for services and supports. Today's training comes through the Illinois HEALS Project, the Recognize, Connect, and Engage framework. And this is a project that has focused on how to increase access and utilization of services and reduce the burden to those who have experienced victimization or trauma in their childhood or more recently. The RCE framework will focus on a couple things. Today will be more about recognition and a little bit about connection and less or none about engagement. Recognition, hoping to improve our ability to identify victimization when it's occurred, to also be able to provide both informal, which may be more conversational, or formal screening, which may be a screening tool to identify the forms of adverse childhood experiences or other victimization for eligibility for program services. Next will be about connecting and how do we connect those individuals to the right supports and services and be able to take some of the burden off of them during times of crisis or times of struggle for families. Although this training is just the tip of the iceberg for the information that could be useful in our roles, many times there's entire master's and doctoral programs focused on this. Today, hopefully you'll leave with a couple of tools and strategies and a little bit more of an understanding about what trauma is. And so first I'll use this analogy as tip of the iceberg that many times what we see, what we hear, what people say, and how they look and how they respond to things is just the surface, right? It's just a little bit of what people are willing to show you or feel safe enough to show you. Many times it may be many, many months and many, many sessions before a person truly starts to reveal themselves in a vulnerable way. And so what we can see on the surface, what we see people do, what we see people say, is really only the tip of the iceberg of understanding what all they're going through or what all has happened to them and what they may be struggling with in their life today or throughout the year. There is a warning here that the content may be a little bit challenging to hear and that it may be distressing even as we talk about crime and victimization and trauma. Throughout this and throughout your role, what we ask that you do is reach out to your immediate supervisor or reach out to me directly if you need to debrief with someone. And since this is what we do, we oftentimes have people available that can debrief with you and be able to allow you the space to be able to process maybe hearing about some hard stuff or hard situations that have happened. That includes if you watch this video and need that, just reach out and we'll connect you with someone within our organization or one of our consultants to be able to provide that type of space for you. And if you have a direct supervisor that can do that, that's good too. But if you need it outside of that particular arrangement or relationship, we have those options as well. First, I'll talk about the 3 E's of trauma. And so when we talk about trauma, I like to talk about it as like a big T and a small t. That oftentimes we hear the word trauma a lot. And so small t is someone's like, that was traumatic for me. Like it was the traffic was so terrible, it was traumatic, or I had a bad day at work, it was traumatizing. And sometimes that is referring to big T trauma. Oftentimes it's not. It's more a reflection of a high stress or an adversive, stressful situation or event that happened to us. When we think about big T trauma is it has a significant impact on me. And so big T trauma is more like a traumatic stress reaction. So it's not just I had a really, really bad day or I had a really, really bad situation. but instead it's plaguing me for many months, weeks, months later. So first, let's talk a little bit about some of these 3 E's and how do we determine or understand a little bit about the variability in trauma. So for a traumatic experience or traumatic event or something to be traumatic, there has to be an event or events, right? Series of events are okay too. That falls in that category. The experience should be a certain unique experience, and then it has to have effects on a person. Many times we might have events and experiences and short-term effects that don't last more than 2 weeks. When they start to last more than 2 weeks, now we're talking about big T trauma. So first, let's talk events. There's different types of events, and what may feel traumatic to you may not be traumatic to someone else, and vice versa. What may be traumatic to me may not be traumatic to someone. There's different types of events that we're exposed to, and each of them can have different types of impacts. And so maybe if it's happening to me directly, and it happens directly to me, maybe that has a different type of impact than if I see it happening to someone else. Then if I see it happening to someone else that I don't know, then if I see it happen to someone else that was a family member, if it happened to my child versus to my wife or spouse, if it happened to my coworker versus to my family member. And so there's different degrees of separation that may or may not impact the effect that this may have on us. Also, when something happens one time, it may have less of an impact than if it happened over and over and over again in my life and over long periods of time. That if certain types of abuse or neglect or trauma has happened to me over a span of 5 years or 10 years, that can have more of a weight or bearing on my psychological functioning. Next, experiences. Not all individuals exposed to events experience them the same way or have the same effect or response to that. And so for some, being what someone else may call physical abuse, for some, that's just their life. And for them, it may not have a significant impact on them. And so sometimes when we're hearing stories or people are telling us and sharing certain experiences, how we react to that does matter. And so if someone doesn't think it's traumatic and it's not hurting them to think that way, then I don't change the way they're thinking about it. I want to leave that I don't need someone to perceive their life as more traumatic or more adversive than it is. This can be hard because when we hear stories and sometimes we imagine our own kids or our grandkids or ourselves being in those situations, that hurts our heart very much. And through our empathic ability, our ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and feel what they're feeling, for us, if we're empathically imagining that, it can be very distressing, and we assume it must be traumatic to them, when in fact, sometimes it's not. In fact, many of the things that we think of as neglectful and abusive, when you look at different cultures and you look at different countries, that what many people might live off of here that are in extreme poverty and maybe even neglectful situations is in fact the norm in other third world countries. And for them, it's a blessing to be able to live with 15 other people. It's a blessing to be able to live off of or earn $4 a day or $4 a week. That's a blessing to them. And so what I want to be able to do is create some space here that when we're talking with someone, it really is like an N of one. Like don't think broader picture. Don't try not to put yourself in that position necessarily and how you would react to that or put your kids in those positions, but instead let them tell their story, how they want to tell it. And it could be, I could be telling you about all of these things that have happened to me, and I'm telling you a story of hope and triumph and resiliency. Or I could be telling you all these things that have happened to me, and I'm telling you a story of victimization, of loss, of grief. And so let me tell my story. And then what our job is oftentimes we're reflecting back. We're trying to react in the same emotion they are, or their emotion plus a little bit less is usually what I'm trying to do. And so that way they don't perceive that there's a certain way they should feel in those experiences. In fact, if I think about my daughter, and maybe when she's a little bit younger, what would happen if she was running and she fell down? And the difference between how I reacted to that and how she felt. I think that's kind of a good analogy of how we want to think about reacting to these things. So if she fell down and I ran over to her and I was like, "Oh my God, baby, are you okay?" Or if I was like, "Oh," then she may cry immediately. That it was, she didn't know how to interpret that without seeing my reaction. Or if I said, "Ow, that hurt. Now we can go play. I'm sorry that happened, but we can still have a good day." Then for her, right, she may hop up and go play and totally that experience is something in the past that doesn't bother her as much. But depending on how other people react, especially people that are considered authorities, right? So that your parents, oftentimes, how they react, especially when you're young, how they react to things tells you how you should react to things and what you should believe about those things. And so unfortunately, our reaction matters. When someone calls into our center, that they may be afraid of a lot of things at that particular point, and how we react to those things that they're sharing with us will determine what they believe about those things, can influence that. And so allow someone's experiences to be their own and allow them to tell their story. And we're more of a mirror of what they're telling, not necessarily adding anything to that, other than we may add hope and validation and reassurance that they're at the right place, that that's what we do here and we're here to help them, and that they found the right place for help and support. Lastly, effects are variable, in that how someone reacts to something can be significantly different than someone else, and that both there's a physical reaction in our reaction to the events and the traumatic stress that might be there, and there's an emotional reaction to that. In this, when we think traumatic stress effects or reactions, when we're looking at this is really what we're here to try to treat. In fact, majority of people have experienced some type of adversity, but it doesn't mean that they need treatment. Not everyone that has experienced something that was adversive needs treatment. Actually, the majority of them do not. So not everyone will have these effects that we can use to determine or define it as traumatic to an individual. There's a couple things to note, that there's an acute trauma reaction, acute or immediate reaction. When something happens, most of the time we're universally distressed, right? Like we're in a car accident. There are a few people that immediately react or in the moment of that react without some type of stress reaction to that. That's normal. As time goes on, when we think about a traumatic stress, typically this stuff still affects me 2 weeks later, and that's called acute stress disorder, or 4 weeks later, which is called post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also something called toxic stress, and this is not traumatic. This is just the effect of stress. It can be traumatic, I guess. It can have that effect, and it's more of like a chronic stressor. But I want to describe toxic stress to help us understand some of the reactions that other people may have, and how hard it is to sometimes understand what somebody is going through. And so the American Academy of Pediatrics defines this as the excessive or prolonged activation of the physiological system in the absence of the buffering protection afforded by stable, responsive relationships. That physiological system is the fight or flight response system. And there's both an electrical reaction within neurons and a chemical reaction between neurons that is connecting certain types of stress chemicals that then, after it reaches a certain threshold, then connects down into like our release of certain hormones and cortisol and adrenaline. And in that, right, that's where our body can feel like our heart will start racing more. Our mind might start to race as well. We may start to feel a lot of energy in our arms and in our legs and in our body. And we may start to feel more tense, and that there's blood going to our extremities versus in certain areas, actually digestion starts to shut down so that the body's ready. And that's where like stress and trauma and stomach aches and digestive problems can go hand in hand. So this excessive or prolonged activation. So with a traumatic event, what can end up happening is that this is an event or series of events that overwhelms my capacity. So it's like psychologically a car landing on me, that my mind cannot handle the amount of weight that's on me psychologically. And so my ability to cope is overwhelmed. I don't have the capacity for that. Maybe that's because of my age, and maybe that's where the vulnerability for young kids may come from. Maybe it's because of my age and I don't have certain coping skills, or maybe it's just because of the weight of the event that's happening or the experience that's happening. Oftentimes we feel out of control or powerless, feelings of terror, feeling like we're going to die. And so this may affect how we trust other people, how we trust ourselves, our sense of safety in the world, whether or not we think people are out to get us, whether or not we think people are trying to hurt us. And that can influence how we navigate these and future stressful situations. And so similarly, right, that when you think about when you've called in to maybe you had, like, if you imagine like you had like a bill that was wrong, like a phone bill or some kind of utility bill that was wrong, they overcharged you for something. And when you call in to go talk to them and you're trying to navigate this and you're trying to listen and get to the right, menu item and know which one's the right one to be able to select. And then you're trying to talk to somebody who is, asking you a bunch of information, and you're trying to get to your solution and what you're there for. That many times, right, that stressful event can start to bring out a part of us, a reaction that may help us understand a little bit about maybe there's some things that have happened that being out of control or being at the mercy of someone else to be able to help you can be a very stressful event, or just all stressful events, that something that may be minor or moderate for somebody else may become very major or very high stress for another person, because those stressful life events remind them of the bad things that happened and the very significant, scary, terrorizing, terror. Think about that terror and powerlessness and out of control, like those types of experiences. It reminds them of that, which is one of the reasons why universally people don't like calling into a system where they have to navigate through different things, or having to try to advocate for themselves, or they don't like going to places like airports where they may feel powerless, they may feel out of control, they feel like they don't have a choice in things, and they have to follow the rules and navigate through that many times people will react stronger than the situation may call for. Maybe even one of us feel that way. So then with toxic stress, oftentimes there's like events and we know what's happened to someone, that if that's what's affecting them. With toxic stress, it may not be easy to understand the things that have happened. And there's not like, oh, and so in understanding from a trauma-informed care approach, understanding what's happened to someone, it may be harder to identify the things that have happened. And so, for example, sometimes people who may be living with a lot of stress, but it's small or moderate amount of stress, there was nothing that was like the weight of a car that I just could not cope with it. And it makes it hard for other people to understand then how this could have had the effect on me like it had. So maybe that's not everybody, but that could be adding up the stressors of living in extreme poverty as an example. And so it's kind of like this cup here. And so this cup is not too heavy. It probably weighs like 2 pounds or something like that. And so if I hold it up though, it's not that it's too heavy for me to hold. It's not like the weight of a car or traumatic. It's not a traumatic event for me to have this and for me to have to hold this weight, this psychological stressor. Imagine it, the weight is a stressor. However, as I hold this, and I don't get any kind of break from that, as I hold this for an hour, for 2 hours, for 4 hours, for 6 hours, for 10 hours, for 24 hours, for 72 hours, as I hold this, what happens is the weight of the object actually doesn't change, but the perception of that weight on my arm, it'll start, after an hour, this thing that weighs maybe 2 pounds probably feels more like 15 or 20 pounds. After 3 hours, 5 hours, I don't know I've not actually done it, but it starts to feel more like 50 pounds, more like 75 pounds. At some point, this light object will feel so heavy my arm cannot hold it up anymore, that my arm will give in or give out under the weight of the 2-pound object. Psychologically, it's the same way. But there's a difference. That physically, I can set this down and give my arm a break for a second, and I pick it back up. I can do those types of repetitions, and that's not unusual for us to be doing that throughout the entire day and throughout our entire lives. With that, I can do those repetitions, and actually that small little break for my arm to relax actually will build up this muscle, right? As long as my arm has the ability to rebuild, even if it's for seconds, that can actually allow me to get stronger and stronger over time. And then I can hold this the rest of my life, if my life depended on it. But in fact, if I try to hold it up, even if my daughter, my kids' lives depend on it, which is a big deal in my eyes, eventually I won't be able to hold it up. No matter how, it's not lack of motivation. It's not lack of motivation that I'm giving in or I'm giving up on the stressors. It won't be lack of motivation. It won't even be a choice. My arm will give out, just like our psychological system will give out if we don't have small breaks to give us a little bit of relaxation. In fact, small breaks, and I pick it back up. To do that actually builds this tolerance, this resiliency that actually allows me to be able to be more capable of handling stress in the future. This is where, even bad things that happen actually make for really good people, iron sharpens iron kind of thing. And so the problem is, if I don't have a place to set it down, and we know that relationships are one of those places to let this down. So if I'm holding this, it may be when I'm on the phone with you, it may be when I know that I have an appointment in the center, when I know even I'm on the wait list, when I know that I'm here, it may be that's the place I get to set this down, a much needed break. And sometimes we may even judge people for napping, falling asleep in the lobby, for wanting to go and take care of something, or just relaxing there, or wanting to go do errands, or needing to go do something else for themselves during these appointments, that maybe this is the one place that I've been able to have that break. So as long as I can have those breaks, it doesn't become so toxic and overwhelming that can take its toll. A little bit about the brain is that it's made up of both electrical and chemical reactions and connections. And we have these neurons, right? And everything that happens with us, everything you think, everything you do, every movement you make, every reaction you have, everything you are, everything that you can do happens in the brain first. And within that, the brain is made of this complex grouping of neurons. And these neurons are little bitty cells that these neurons are within them create an electrical current that moves from one to the other, and then between them has a chemical. And these chemicals are, there's a couple really important chemicals, and then there's many others, but oftentimes these chemicals such as serotonin and norepinephrine and dopamine, these things are the chemicals that actually connect the bottom part of the brain to the top part of the brain. There's about 80 to 100 billion neurons. So billion, which is, I don't know if anybody's looked at the difference between a million and a billion, right? A million is a lot. I think you can count, I'm going to estimate this. I think it's like 3.5 weeks or something like that is what it takes for you to count 1, 2, 3, 4 to count to a million. And it takes 33 years to count to a billion. So think about that difference there. And in fact, to count to a trillion, you can't do it in your lifetime. I think it takes over 300 years to be able to count to a trillion. And so a billion, and now we're talking 80 to 100 billion of these. And each one of these little neurons, not only do neurons matter, but neural connections matter. And how much do they connect to other neurons? And so these neurons, and you can see kind of like they're these spidery type things, their connections in full maturity around like 2,500 connections to other neurons. And what we want to be able to do is, right, we want to see this development happen, but this development matters a lot. And this is one of the reasons we do early childhood work, is that in the first 3 years of life, 80% of our neurons are developed and our neural connections. And so it's when we're building the brain that the brain is most vulnerable. It can affect a person, but it also is most resilient. That if we have the right supports, and we can build those supports and strategies and therapies and services, that it can actually overcome that. And it's not that we can't overcome it in adulthood, but it's a matter of the amount of time or energy that it takes. So if you imagine like building a house, that it's when you're building the foundation that if you see some problems happening and you address it while you're building the foundation, if you see problems with the foundation, it's a lot easier to do than to try to fix the foundation with a house built on top of it, or any portion. If you're working on then the walls, it's a lot easier to work on those walls and repair those walls before you put up drywall and paint and all of that. It's a lot easier to fix any of those structural issues that might be there. So you can't have a really well-built, stable home on a rocky or unstable foundation. And it doesn't matter if you put the best roof on there and you had the best experience, think about it later on in life, you had the best experiences. If the foundation needs to be worked on, that's where the effort needs to be. And so it's kind of like even language development is a good example of this. It's not a matter of that we can't learn a language later on in life, but the first 7 years of life, when the brain is developing, is one of the best times to learn a language. And so the effort that you can get Rosetta Stone or whatever it is, the effort that it takes may be hundreds of times more effort as an adult as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old would have to put in to be able to learn a second language. The other thing about our neurons and our neural connections is that the more we use something, the more it grows. And so the more we experience something, the more it'll grow and the more it'll happen for us. Within this, we have two different areas. We have the cerebral cortex, the CEO of the brain. Then we have the limbic system. The limbic system is where like our raw drives, emotions are, all of our anger and sadness and depression and all those types of things, anxieties, that all lies here. But our cerebral cortex, our CEO, is that's where that's where I lie, to be a good dad and a good husband and help people and be a good Christian. That's where this is. All language ability, all problem solving, all planning for the future, being able to examine problem solving of like, if I do this, what are the consequences? If I do that, what are the consequences? That all lies up here. Down here are just pure emotions, pure reactions to things, knee-jerk reactions. But there are even real life examples of going limbic. Some of those examples include, certain people might feel a certain way when they're on the road or when there's a lot of traffic, and you may start to feel certain types of rage or certain uncomfortableness or anxieties that end up making you feel different than what you normally are, be different than you normally are. Maybe even when you're around your in-laws, or maybe that's even just regular family members that you're around, that when you're around those individuals, you are not yourself. That's very much a similar experience, that sometimes what we end up doing is we judge people by their reactions they would be behind the wheel or with their in-laws or family members, or some of the most stressful situations that, think about, for them, it may be calling into the center. It may be asking for help. It may be depending on somebody else that is that activating that stressful life event that ends up having less of their prefrontal cortex working and more of their limbic system working. And that there's more emotional response than there is more of a logical or rational response to things. And if none of those things relate to you, even think about like certain insects and animals, that there are certain things that when you're around them, you're not yourself, right? Like you would knock down a friend, you would scream at the top of your lungs, you would be angry, you would punch somebody, you would argue with anybody to be able to get away from these things that are scary. And I'll take a moment here, but take a deep breath, and there won't be any more of those pictures. But we would do things to get away from all of that. The difficult part of trauma work is that two things can look exactly the same, and that one person may interpret that thing one way while another person interprets it a different way. That, like, I'm afraid of spiders, and one person has pets that are spiders, while I don't want any spiders to live around me ever. And I'm spraying and killing and that kind of stuff for spiders. But that we can see two things, like a saxophone player or a young lady or a seal or a donkey, that it can be really confusing, that we can see things from different perspectives, and it seems so real to us. And the question is, which one is right? And the answer is both are right. That you might have experienced maybe witnessing domestic violence in your home, and that made you a better spouse and made you a better person, while someone else witnessed that, and that made them be more like the aggressor and commit domestic violence, or to be anxious and not react to things, situations that they don't have control or they don't get to make the decisions for themselves, that those individuals may react strongly to it. It's really confusing. And that's where, for us, we want to allow someone to tell their story any version they want to tell. Next are ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences are a list of events. They're not, that does not mean traumatic. So adverse childhood experiences does not mean traumatic. They're adversive or stressful life events, but not traumatic events unless they tell me it's traumatic, unless it has the effect on a person. Doesn't automatically mean traumatic. Just because someone's experienced what we would define as emotional abuse, like verbal abuse, being degraded and down, all of that on a regular basis, physical abuse, being hit, punched, kicked, or sexual abuse, being fondled, touched, penetrated, that even though those things have happened, that's just the abuse portion of that. Doesn't mean that a person was affected by that or that they have psychological impact on their life or their well-being because of those things. Doesn't automatically mean that. Again, around 50, 60% of people are actually going to be resilient. They're going to be successful, even though those bad things have happened to them. And so we want to give people that space to have their own version of their story that they get to share. And so when in doubt, we want to listen. When we're doing something like a screener for adverse childhood experiences, and most of our projects and our mission, our work here at the center is to help individuals that have experienced adversity in their childhood. That adversity can affect me my entire lifespan, or it can affect me just in my early years. But the point of understanding the brain and when the brain is developing and when the most change is happening in the brain, the foundation is being built, is that we believe in early intervention, and that the earlier we intervene, the better the outcome. And so if I can intervene, if something happened to someone in their early infancy life, in their first 6 months of life, I want to be intervening and working with them their next 6 months of life, right? I want to be working with an 8-month-old, a 1-year-old. That work looks very different, right? Where I'm working with a lot of caregivers or supportive adults, but we want to work with them as young as as young as these things are happening to them, that the amount of effort that they have to put in, the amount of change, the amount of sessions or treatment is significantly, sometimes hundreds of times less than what happens when we're trying to treat this in adulthood. And so we want to be able to make this change. We want to be able to intervene as early as possible, which is why many of our projects, Resiliency Project, Illinois Heals, the family centers, Carbondale Family Center, El Dorado Family Center, many of these projects focus on younger and younger families. We have a real passion, want to work more with birth to 5 families. A lot of those young families, that's more, we're working with a lot of the caregivers and the children together or even separate, but the caregiver is highly involved. When you get into adolescent years and stuff like that, some individual work may not have caregivers as involved. And people are starting to, or youth are starting to become more independent. And it's more about their internalized choices and things they can process themselves. But what we want to do is we want to influence this as early as it happens. Different than some other types of research out there, like toxic stress and the weight of the activation of our fight or flight response system or prolonged or physiological response system without the buffering effect of relationships or traumatic events that we might feel terrorized or out of control or feel like our life is threatened or sexually we're being violated in some way. That different than those things is that adverse childhood experiences is about the stacking up of multiple types. So it's not about how often it happened, whether or not it was what we consider a chronic trauma or chronic stressor, or if it was an acute stressor, a one-time immediate stressor. It's not about how often it happened or how it happened or what it happened to us. Adverse childhood experiences is about the stacking on of these things that have happened are more like risk factors. The more risk factors we have, the more likely it impacts us, but picture a scale that we try to build up as much protective factors. And those protective factors are going to keep or decrease the odds that these risk factors are going to hurt us. And so these are risk factors that stack up that different types of abuse, dysfunction, or neglect have happened to someone in their childhood. And that's the first 18 years of life. I want to show just a quick preview of, and I'll just define kind of how this looks and what it looks like. So essentially, you can read any of these, and I'm going to go through them really quickly, that a person who has 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, they report 4 or more in their adult life, because adverse childhood experiences is the study of adults and their well-being based on their retrospective or recall of their childhood. And so a person who had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences was what looks like 1,120% more likely, 1,120% more likely to attempt suicide than someone who had 0. So that's the way you can read that. What we know about adverse childhood experiences is that it has significant impact for increasing the odds of heart disease, suicide, sexualized behaviors in teen, our intercourse or number of partners that we've had, our early intercourse in life, our addictions to drugs or multiple partners, because oftentimes we're going to turn to a few things that in having a dopamine deficiency and not having enough dopamine is that we're going to turn to things that can give us dopamine, which will be like sex, drugs, alcohol, risk taking. Those are all things that naturally release dopamine, that we're going to turn towards those things for more addiction. Not to mention the body, whenever it's highly stressed, will end up deteriorating earlier than when someone has a less stressful life for them, where they're activated less in their stress or fight or flight response system. And so we see depression increases, obesity increases, we see lung disease increases, smoking, initiation of smoking, drug use, injectable drug use, any type of drug problem, and we see cancer and divorce and lifestyle. We see so many things that are all tied into and or have some predictable power through the number of adverse childhood experiences that correlate with those conditions or struggles in adulthood. We'll watch a quick video that will help us understand a little bit more about trauma in the brain.
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when
I apologize for that. We'll resume the video. We lost audio there for a minute.
you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones. And everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
Hopefully that video was helpful in understanding and seeing demonstrations of how trauma can affect the brain and our social connections, interactions with others. What we know is that healthy relationships are one of the most important protective factors. Think of protective factors that promote resilience. They may protect us. They may outweigh the risk or the problems or the struggles we've had, the good things in our life. And that there are certain proven protective factors that are more like shields or armor that keep bad things from hurting us, even though there are things that are happening around us, that this armor can protect us if these good things exist. And one of the most important are healthy relationships, supportive adult relationships and friend relationships, etc. Also, when we have access to concrete resources and supports, a support system, and that they're able to help us navigate the concrete needs, the immediate needs that we might have. Having a sense of community or connection with the community that you're in, whether that's a community of people or if that's a community in a city or church, whatever that might be, and how our culture interacts with that sense of community. Access to services and utilization of services are also protective factors. Having safe and supportive environments that you can feel secure. Again, a place that you can maybe like set this stressor down. You can set that cup down that gives you a break. As we think about recognize, connect, and engage, I want to talk about a couple of different ways of thinking of this. And one is that we want to recognize it first. Now, this can be asking about it, right? What all kinds of things have happened, or what brought you into our services? What has you calling us now? And they may be able to tell us those things, but also even noticing maybe reactions to things, some of the behavioral cues, some of the just noticeable things that you see, and then connecting to resources that are available in some way, and then providing evidence-based, culturally specific and humble, effective services to engage them in. So as we're thinking about screening, and we're spending our time to be able to prepare for when someone calls in, how do I screen, how do I assess for the things that have happened, especially given we don't have as much resources available to just take all clients, but instead to be able to start screening of which project can those clients be a part of, those folks that are calling in be a part of. There are some challenges that we know about, and that sometimes people may lack awareness, or we lack awareness even, to the signs of trauma and understanding what things could have been adversive or traumatic. We may be inconsistent, where some people get screened a certain way and other people get screened a different way. And oftentimes that happens maybe from like clinician to clinician, although folks are trained oftentimes to be able to do screening and identification practices. The other challenge is it can look different. One person could be really angry and aggressive towards other people as a reaction to the traumatic experiences they've had, while another person may be very quiet, depressed, sad, down, low energy, that could be a reaction to the traumatic experiences that they've had. Here's just a quick list of some of the signs of trauma and victimization. One of the difficulties of these signs is that these could also be signs of many other things as well. And so keep that in mind, that one of these doesn't automatically mean that someone has experienced trauma or traumatic stress. It can look like many different things. And again, just because one of these things exists does not mean automatically that it's trauma, but instead to give the space as people were talking about some of their struggles and some of the things that they're, what brings them here to us, and that there's space for that those things could be related to the traumatic experiences, if that's what they're sharing with you, that can make sense, that sleep can be affected, that energy levels can be affected, misperception of situations or triggers could be related. In general, we want to be able to try to listen, provide responsive listening, and to hold back our judgment, and to not necessarily engage or argue. If someone believes certain things or if they're reacting a certain way, we want to try to de-escalate that situation. And we want to be able to hold back judgment, even if we do have opinions, and we're trying to leave that at the door as we're talking with someone. And one of the big fundamental shifts that we want to be able to go towards is this curiosity around what has happened to you versus what's wrong with you. So when we're working with someone, or what's wrong with your child, to what's happened to your child, and that we want to learn what's happened to them. And that's what a lot of eligibility for our different programs or practices may come from. Just taking a moment, you can pause it if you need to. How do you recognize in our agency now? Recognize, identify trauma and victimization. How could you recognize? In summary, we want to be aware and understand that trauma does happen and it does affect people, and that we want to have some knowledge of some of the signs and risks around victimization or trauma. We want to try to respond without judgment and try to be more of a mirror when someone is reacting or discussing what's happened to them. A couple of specific strategies or skills. One is to think about the setting. Think about when you're able to give them the attention that they deserve. And is there a quiet and neutral setting? Sometimes you may even have to step out of the room that you're in to be able to talk more with someone. You may need to close the door. You may need to make sure no one can overhear another person. So who's in the lobby, who's not in the lobby, who's within kind of an earshot of hearing what we're talking about, that may be able to create a safer, more trusting space to be able to answer these questions. Sometimes people like to be able to answer, or they would more likely write it down on a piece of paper or answer the actual form than to verbally answer that information. Sometimes people may not be able to have the reading ability, may not have their glasses or other things, or may not have updated lenses. And so sometimes you might want to ask, like, would you like to take this and go ahead and complete it? Or I can read each one of these to you and you can tell me the answer to it. And by offering that, what we end up doing is creating a universal space that someone who may not have the reading ability or may not have the tools that are necessary are able to process this information. And so then you read it aloud and you try to read it with just kind of a matter-of-fact way. When you're doing that, whether you're on the phone or you're in person, we try not to lead questions. Like, we want to read it exactly how it is. We read the instructions to them, even though it takes a little bit more time to do that. And then we read the question, and then we read the responses to them. And then we try to do that in a very matter-of-fact tone so that we're not leading them to want to say no to certain things or want to say yes to other things, that we just want to have their true answers when we're doing that. We're also holding back our emotional response. And I'm going to read one of these here in just a minute. But we're holding back our emotional response. That, yeah, some of this stuff is very saddening to be able to hear, while also being able to know that we can talk to somebody if we need to, and we can debrief with our supervisor. Or again, if nothing else, you can reach out to me if your supervisor doesn't know what to do with that. And we can connect you with someone to do a debrief with you after doing any of these screenings if you need to. We want to be a mirror, because again, I don't want to create the belief for someone that they're worse off than they are. We want to still keep instilling hope for the future, and that they're in the right place. That it's not uncommon for me to have someone that tells me they haven't told anybody because they didn't think those people could handle it. And so we want to make sure that they believe we can handle hearing this hard stuff, even though we know it takes a lot we have to do a lot to take care of ourselves to be able to handle this hard stuff too. Don't let people swear you to secrecy. It may not be possible to be able to do that. We want to also be comfortable with silence, that sometimes if someone's crying, someone's upset, we're going to let them do this for a while. We're going to let them sit there and cry for a little while or be silent. That can be part of it. We don't guarantee that things will get better, but we do let them know that they're in the right place, that it's here. We're here for you. It's here that we have good tools. We have good clinicians. Give them belief and hope that it is possible here that it will get better. How I might introduce this particular survey. And again, this is just one way. If someone already tells me, they're like, well, this is, she's been sexually abused by blah, 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 and doesn't see her father anymore, then in that, right, now we've got, I'm able to deduce, I don't need to ask them any of these questions, that now primary would be sexual abuse, primary adverse childhood experiences that I'd put in patient comments would be sexual abuse, and secondary would be abandonment or loss of a caregiver as the secondary. And so I don't really need to go further than that. And I assume it's some of the primary things because they brought it up on their own in the conversation, which makes me assume that it is the more salient, more important type of adversity that they've experienced. If they're not able to give that, if you ask the question, what brings you here or what brings you in now, then, or what kinds of things have happened that bring you into us for services, then they may give you kind of a list of things and you can deduce what primary and secondary form, and that for Resiliency Project, we have to have 2 different forms of victimization. And so you may find yourself just in that format. You don't need a formal screener. You don't have to use this tool. Some of you may want to use this tool, and that's okay too. Or if you can't get the answers, if they're not really hitting on those points of adversity, then you may want to ask these particular questions to be able to get to that. How I would do this is that I would let them know that, and I'll do this in role play here in a moment, or modeling that, but I would let them know that part of our eligibility for services here at the Stress and Trauma Treatment Center is that youth will, we serve youth that have experienced adversity or trauma in their background. And we have a short survey that they can complete to be able to give us that information. And so that's how I might introduce it. Then I'm going to go through the instructions and I'm going to read each of these items. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into that now. And I'll do just a quick modeling of what that is. And so if I'm on the phone, let's assume I'm on the phone, somebody's called and I'm trying to determine whether or not they're eligible for Resiliency Project, so that we can get them in for services under one of those, one of our clinicians that are funded through that project. So I'll just start and I'll just say action. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for calling and thank you for sharing about that. It sounds like there are some things that have happened. One of the things one of the pieces of information that we need to be able to determine eligibility, and this is not always easy to ask or to share about, but we want to be able to learn about some of the adversive experiences that have happened to your child to figure out whether or not they're eligible for our project that's called Resiliency Project. Is it okay with you if I go through and ask you certain questions about the adversities that have happened up until now for him? Okay, if you're okay with that, I'd like to ask you some questions about events that happened during his life. Some of these are sensitive questions that may make you feel uncomfortable. Keep in mind that if you can't answer one, you just say skip. And you don't have to answer all of these questions while we're on the phone today. And you can follow up more with a counselor and therapist after we get you scheduled for an appointment. Before the age of 18, or he's 12. So anytime in his life, I'm going to ask you these questions. You tell me how often these things have happened. For your child, how often did your family experience serious financial problems? Would you say never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often? Okay, very often. Okay, thank you. Next one, how often was he hungry because your family could not afford food? Would you say never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often? Okay. And in this, I might be listening a little bit. She starts to tell me a story. And then I might interject a little bit if it starts to feel like that story is going to keep going on and on. Yeah, it sounds like that's, and here I am. Sounds like that was pretty tough, that stuff that happened. Would you say how often would you say that happened? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often? Okay. And then she may want to keep going into a story, but I'm going to go ahead and move into the next item. How often was he or your family homeless when he was growing up, or in the last 12 years? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often? Okay. All right. Never. How often did a parent or adult in your home ever swear at you, insult you, or put you down, or put him down, specifically for him? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often? Yeah, I'll repeat it again. How often did a parent or adult in your home ever swear at you or swear at him, insult him, or put him down? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Okay, thank you. So it sounds like rarely. How often was he bullied or severely teased by other children or adolescents? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. So in this, something that we're doing is I'm giving her the options because she can't see it, right? It's a lot easier to be able to answer this if you're seeing it. But I'm going to give her each one of those options. If she interjects and I say, before age 18, how often was there an adult in his household who tried hard to make sure his basic needs were met? Meaning food, shelter, clothing, and medical care. And I'm like, never, rarely. And she's going to say all the time. Okay. And I'm just going to write down that answer. I'm not going to keep asking or giving the prompts for that. I'm now going to move into the next item. How often was there? And my cadence is I'm going to read all the response options afterwards, but she can interject anytime if she knows the answer. And if she says something that's kind of in the middle, she'll be like, occasionally, then that's probably sometimes, right? I don't make her have to say the exact words. If she says all the time, then that's very often, right? And so I'm going to go through this. And then you see like some of these start to change. Never once, more than once, never once, more than once. Yes or no. And I might even ask this question this way. Yes or no, did he live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or suicidal? No? Okay. Yes or no, did he live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic? No? Okay. And then I just go through, I don't worry about answering any of this down here. It doesn't matter. You could ask them this question here at the end, especially if you're starting to notice some stuff, like it seems to be pretty heavy. Overall, how uncomfortable did you feel answering these questions on this survey today? And if they're like extremely uncomfortable, you can ask them, do you need someone to call you back to be able to do a debrief with you about some of this stuff that's kind of come up during our conversation today? We don't want to offer that for everybody, right? Not at all, slightly or moderately, but we can offer it if it's has an extreme impact on them that these questions had. And that's okay that you text me or your immediate supervisor, and we can have somebody follow up to be able to do a 10, 15-minute debrief with them to be able to give them some space to talk through that. What you see here too are these highlighted options, and this link will be available to you in the Medicaid protocol. And in here, anything that's in the highlighted version, that means that is a 1. So how would I score this? I would score this, if I were to score it, it'd be like, this would be, if it's here, 1, 2, 3, 4, for our resiliency project, what we know is they have to experience 2. So if there's 2 of these that are in the yellow or highlighted portion, then they're eligible for that. And that's all we need to do. is just figure out that they have at least 2. We can let the clinician later on be able to determine what is the primary and secondary form of adverse childhood experiences. If you know that information, go ahead and put in the patient comments. If they say, if there's only 2 of them, then you know the primary and secondary. If they say, really, I'm here to talk to you about the sexual abuse or the physical abuse that he went through, then you already know the answer. Go ahead and put it in there. But if they need to talk further with the clinician during an intake, they'll have a lot more time with that person to be able to learn more and determine which was the primary and secondary. Resiliency is our goal, right? There are around 70% of people have experienced at least one form of adverse childhood experiences. The majority of those people are resilient, but some are not. And we're going to get the ones that are not most of the time. Most of the time, people aren't calling to let us know that something bad happened to them, but they're doing really well. Usually, we're seeing more of when really bad things have happened and it's impacting, it's hurt someone in some way. So we want to be growing resiliency. We want to do that throughout our time, our work together. The definition of resiliency, or a definition of resiliency, is the process of or capacity for or outcome of successful adaptation despite challenging or threatening circumstances. So we still want an adaptive outcome despite challenging or stressful circumstances. Definition of protective factors, or a definition, influences that modify, ameliorate, or alter a person's response to some environmental hazard that predisposes to a maladaptive outcome. So something that keeps the negative outcome from happening. And as we talked about before, we want this balance, almost thinking of this scale, that there's plenty of risks, there's plenty of reasons why a person will fail or will struggle or will have psychological pain or dysfunction, distress. But we want to build up the other reasons why they don't have to have that. Build up those protective factors, those relationships, that community, those services, those supports, the being good at, talented in something, participating in extracurricular activities or after-school programs, having relationships, mentorship, building parent-child relationships, whatever that needs to be that protects them. As we're connecting people with more services, one of the things we're going to try to do is to shift the burden from the system to the system rather than the victim. If you imagine being around a spider and you're really afraid of spiders, or whatever it is, in-laws, whatever that is, what is your functioning level at that point? And the reality is, the more distressed we are, the more upset we are, the lower our IQ is, or our functional ability is. It's called state-dependent functioning. It's based on the state we're in. Our functioning is dependent on that state, that emotional state we're in. So the more upset, distressed, uncomfortable we are, the less we function well. And so how do we, as the providers, and we hear this stuff a lot, and we are equipped in how to navigate our own system, to get appointments, to get scheduled, to be able to get the supports that are needed. How do we take on that burden? Because we can navigate that well for them, easily for them. So how do we take on more of that burden, knowing there's a lot that they're dealing with in those situations? In that, one of the strategies we have for connection is that the first person they get in contact with can connect them with services, the immediate services. And so how can they connect them to services? We want to make sure that there's not a callback later on for scheduling to happen, that someone, whoever answers the phone and gets that first connection, is able to get them scheduled or in for services or talking to someone as soon as possible. If we can, we want to make that connection right away. If we're able to, even if there's a clinician that's available right then, we want to be able to make those connections if we know they're eligible for our services and they meet our criteria for that. And then when we do make those connections, we want to make sure those connections are safe accessible to them, and maybe it's location, maybe it's certain types of other accessibility options, like is there an interpreter needed, etc., and comfortable. So when people are coming in, we want to make sure that they're comfortable. We may offer them some water or give them something to drink. We might even give them snacks and help them feel safe and secure. We want to have nice setup where people can watch TV and distract themselves, or we have comfortable temperatures. We want comfortable chairs, things like that, and toys and friendly environment, those types of things that can help someone feel comfortable while they're here. Knowing, right, that there's a lot of reason why they're afraid or they're activated, because they're about to talk about some of the things that are most uncomfortable to talk about. When we think about a trauma-informed organization, there's a couple of things that we want to think about. One is that we realize that there's a widespread impact, that lots and lots of people are impacted by trauma, whether that's small t trauma or if it's big T trauma. And understanding that there are potential paths for recovery. Some of those may happen naturally without us, with the right protective factors, resiliency, especially relationships and things. And others will happen because of us, right? Or in conjunction or in partnership with us, that through treatment services, we can help build those resiliency factors, protective factors that can help someone be successful. We want to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms, not make everybody do a screener, because if they already know what they're there for, you're already able to deduce that from the conversation. If you're open into questions of what brings you in for what are you here for, or what can we help you with, then you already know that information. There's no need for a screener at that particular point. And we want to involve them in the process, the decision-making process, what appointment times, what appointment options there are. Sometimes we don't have, right? If everybody's booked up, we don't have options for after-school appointment times, and that's not going to be an option for them, but we want them to be able to weigh their options and be able to make decisions for themselves. We want to be able to integrate, understand about trauma and all things that we do, our procedures, our practices. And this is one of the reasons why this training actually exists, or this video exists. And then we want to resist re-traumatization. A lot of re-traumatization, sometimes there's a myth out there that re-traumatization comes from people sharing about the things that have happened or needing to share that, like when you're doing a screener or something like that. The reality is that actually is the treatment too, right? To share about it. You just have to make sure you give them enough space, or we do the debriefing afterwards if that's a necessary piece for somebody who may have to share about some of those things that, in fact, it is the leaning into talking about, processing the things that have happened that will actually be what helps someone overcome the trauma that's happened. Re-traumatization, though, can happen by forcing people to answer and talk about things they don't want to talk about. So if they don't want to talk about it, that's okay. They don't want to, if they skip an item, they get to skip an item on the screener. If they don't want to share all of the stuff, that's okay. They can share that when they're ready throughout the treatment episode. The other is to react in a certain way. So if I react as if their stuff is traumatic, then it may re-traumatize them. If I react as if their stuff is not traumatic, then it may re-traumatize them, right? So we don't want to go either extreme. We want to mirror what they're telling us or how they're reacting to things. So I don't want to invalidate them by being like, that's not a big deal. That happens to everybody. Yeah, I was bullied too. This is not, this is just part of growing up, a rite of passage. For somebody who's been bullied, that it was traumatic for, around like 26 to 40% of kids have experienced bullying. But there may be around 5%, though, that bullying was traumatic for. If it was, we treat it as if it was. And I'm sorry that happened, or that sounded really hard or really tough on you. So I'm going to reflect. If they tell me it was really bad, I'll be like, that sounded really bad or really tough. I might use the same words that they tell me. So I'm going to try to mirror, and that's how we avoid re-traumatization as well. So allow them to control what they share about and mirror their reaction, their response to it, even their wording on it. Some of the key principles for trauma-informed care and trauma-informed organizations is to prioritize first safety. We want to make sure that people feel safe and secure. So people need to know kind of who all's here, will such and such, what happens if certain things, or maybe that's even like feeling comfortable about like what directions on how to get to the facility, or how do I know where to check in at? Where's the lobby? What does the lobby feel like? What is the experience like? Are there people like me that look like me, sound like me that I'm going to interact with? All of those may be safety procedures. We want to be transparent to promote trustworthiness. And so let them know that they can trust us. I'm transparent around the process of next, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to, we're scheduling, or I'm picking a clinician for you based on location. You might be able to give them options of, do you want to be in this office or this office? Do you want a young clinician or an older clinician? And sometimes you don't have as many options. And so only give them options that you can give. Sometimes we can say, do you want a male or female? And sometimes we don't have that option to be able to give that. So we can't give them those options if we don't have them. We want to promote that they are kind of the leaders of their own life. They are the experts of their family. And so peer support and supporting each other can be very powerful. We want to promote collaboration and mutual respect. Again, that we don't have all the answers, that together we're going to work to be able to create something better for them in their life. So as much as we can, we want to empower them, allow them to choose, allow them their voice to be clear in the decisions that are being made. And then last but not least, we want to understand kind of their culture, the things that have historically happened to them, some of their gender issues and how they're treated by others throughout the world. And we're trying to create a safe place, a welcoming and accepting place for them when they're here. And so if that's around bathroom issues, right, of whether or not I don't feel like I fit in the female bathroom or the male bathroom, then how can we create space? And many of our offices, there's single bathrooms. So it's really, that's all gender. Anybody can go in there. It's a single person at a time. And then other settings, we actually have an all gender bathroom for. And so how do we navigate that for those who might need it and create safe space for them to understand kind of what they've gone through or how they see things in their life. I want to say thank you for taking the time, for trying to learn some of this stuff. And I know you already know a lot of it, and hopefully this is helpful on the screening process for clients that are coming in for services. Thank you very much.